I'm General Ulysses S. Grant, and I welcome you back to the library this day for part 3 of my reflections and examination and lifting up for your attention the Lieber Code and specific articles therein. There were 157 articles. The Lieber Code was brought about as a result of a need for the humane and orderly legal treatment of prisoners of war and contraband of war, the runaway black people coming to freedom within our lines, and also the physical property as we move through a landscape in fighting the war. Much was needed. President Lincoln ordered that a committee be formed that was composed of 4 generals, Henry Waker Halleck for one, and a civilian legal expert, Francis Lieber. And Lieber essentially wrote it. The 4 generals concurred, gave it their blessing, sent it on to President Lincoln, who issued it in July of 1863 under General Orders 100. And in the first 2 looks at the Lieber Code, I covered a number of different articles. In this final part, I should like to lift up some of the articles of import and even give a couple of examples of orders that I gave early in the war, January 62, indeed that predated the Lieber Code, but which are indicative of the humanity that I had in the treatment of civilians and soldiers alike, protection of property and retaliation. But first, in this third part, in the review, I'd like to lift up Article 57 and 58, which address 2 of the key issues driving a codified approach to warfare and how we treat prisoners of war and how to treat prisoners of war fairly without recognizing the so-called Southern Confederacy as a sovereign nation. Article 57 said, so soon as a man is armed by a sovereign government and takes the soldier's oath of fidelity, he is a belligerent. His killing, wounding, or other warlike acts are not individual crimes or offenses. No belligerent has a right to declare that enemies of a certain class, color, or condition, when properly organized as soldiers, will not be treated by him as public enemies. That squarely addressed the former slave who is now fighting as a United States soldier. The next article, 58, goes a bit further and says, the law of nations knows of no distinction of color, and if an enemy of the United States should enslave and sell any captured persons of their army, it would be a case for the severest retaliation. If not redressed upon complaint, as soon as we made them aware of this, the action is stopped. The United States cannot retaliate by enslavement. Therefore, death must be the retaliation for this crime against the law of nations. So the Lieber Code definitively addresses the treatment of former slaves or people of color who want to fight in the United States Army. Something else that the Lieber Code did that was of great moment was the definition of military necessity. A couple of the articles that cover that are Article 14, which says military necessity, as understood by modern civilized nations, consists in the necessity of those measures which are indispensable for securing the ends of the war, and which are lawful according to the modern law and usage of war. Article 15 says in part, military necessity admits of all direct destruction of life or limb of armed enemies, and of other persons whose destruction is incidentally unavoidable in the armed contests of the war. It allows of capturing of every armed enemy and every enemy of importance to the hostile government, or of peculiar danger to the captor. I want to repeat that, or of peculiar danger to the captor. It allows of all destruction of property and obstruction of all the ways and channels of traffic, etc., and so forth. And the article ends with this statement: men who take up arms against one another in public war do not cease on this account to be moral beings, responsible to one another and to God. Article 16, finally, says, military necessity does not admit of cruelty, that is, the infliction of suffering for the sake of suffering or for revenge, nor of maiming or wounding, except in fight, nor of torture to extort confessions. Now, an order that I gave from Cairo, Illinois, on January the 13th of 1862 says this in addressing destruction of property. We were about to move on Fort Donelson. We'd taken Fort Henry and Hyman. It had fallen as well. And we're moving on Fort Donelson, going across some 12 miles of land between the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers. But I issued General Order Number 2 that said, during the absence of the expedition, now starting upon soil occupied almost solely by the rebel army, and when it is a fair inference that every stranger met is an enemy, the following orders will be observed. Troops on marching will be kept in the ranks, company officers being held strictly accountable for all stragglers from their companies. No firing will be allowed in camp or on the march, not strictly required in the performance of duty. While in camp, no privilege will be granted to officers or soldiers to leave their regimental grounds, and all violations of this order must be promptly and summarily punished. Disgrace, having been brought upon our brave fellows by the reckless or the bad conduct of some of their members, showing on all occasions when marching through territory occupied by sympathizers of the enemy, a total disregard of the rights of citizens, and being guilty of wanton destruction of private property, the general commanding desires and intends to enforce a change in this regard. The interpreting of confiscation acts by troops themselves has a demoralizing effect, weakens them in exact proportions to the demonstration, and makes open and armed enemies of many who, from opposite treatment, would become friends or at most non-combatants. It is ordered, therefore, that the severest punishment be inflicted upon every soldier who is guilty of taking or destroying private property, and any commissioned officer guilty of like conduct or of countenancing it shall be deprived of his sword and expelled from the camp, not to be permitted to return. On the march, cavalry advance guards will be thrown out, etc., so forth, the logistics of the march. I was sternly laying out my expectations for this march and made the observation opposite treatment of harshness and cruelty would endear people to us. The harshness and the cruelty will make potential killing enemies of people who would not otherwise be so, perhaps even our friends. So military necessity includes doing what the Army's got to do to sustain itself, protect itself, and move itself, but no more. Leave the personal property and persons of the people of the countryside that you're moving through alone. Leave them alone. Don't exacerbate an already bad situation. A final note here. Article 69 said, outposts, sentinels, or pickets are not to be fired upon, except to drive them in, or when a positive order, special or general, has been issued to that effect. Nobody in the Army likes the idea of sniping at the pickets, because most men in the Army have to walk picket post. This was felt to be so important, critical in the thinking of the soldier, that it is a specific article unto itself. Outposts, sentinels, or pickets are not to be fired upon, except to drive them in, which is your standard combat, or when a positive order, special or general, has been given for that, to that effect, for whatever reason. And Article 27 says, the law of war can no more wholly dispense with retaliation than can the law of nations, of which it is a branch. Yet civilized nations acknowledge retaliation as the sternest feature of war. A reckless enemy often leaves to his opponent no other means of securing himself against the repetition of barbarous outrage. And Article 28, the next article, says, retaliation will therefore never be resorted to as a measure of mere revenge, but only as a means of protective retribution, and moreover, cautiously and unavoidably, that is to say, retaliation shall only be resorted to after careful inquiry into the real occurrence and the character of the misdeeds that may demand retribution. Well, I issued this order on January the 11th of 1862 to General Ulysses S. at Bird's Point, Missouri, on the other side of the river from where I was heading for Fort Donelson. And the order reads, I understand that 4 of our pickets were shot this morning. Now, this is at Bird's Point, Missouri, 70 miles southwest of St. Louis, hotly contested area. I understand that 4 of our pickets were shot this morning. If this is so, and appearances indicate that the assassins were citizens, not regularly organized into the rebel army, the whole country should be cleared out for 6 miles around, and word given that all citizens making their appearance within those limits are liable to be shot. To execute this, patrols should be sent out in all directions and bring into camp at Bird's Point all citizens together with their subsistence, and require them to remain under penalty of death and destruction of their property until properly relieved. Let no harm befall these people if they quietly submit, but bring them in, and place them in camp below the breastwork, and have them properly guarded. The intention is not to make political prisoners of these people, but to cut off a dangerous class of spies. This applies to all classes and conditions, age and sex. If, however, women and children prefer other protection that we can provide, they may be allowed to retire beyond the limits indicated, not to return until authorized. By order of U.S. Grant, Brigadier General Commanding. Now, the emphasis should be if they prefer protection other than we can afford them to move outside the limits. Remember, the order stipulates 6 miles around that fort, 6 miles. And to return within that 6 miles is to subject oneself to the possibility of being shot. And I also said, let no harm come to these people if they quietly submit, but bring them in. I was going to brook no nonsense. 4 of my pickets had been shot walking picket duty by civilians, irregulars, not military from the Confederacy. So, in summary about the Lieber Code, I should like to say that it is essentially the golden rule. It's treat one another as you would be treated. But to go further than that and be specific in addressing the treatment of the freed slaves and people of color who were fighting, because the Southerners had said they were going to indeed execute their white officers and sell them into slavery again, send them back to the state that they were originally from. And we weren't going to have that. In fact, prisoner exchanges were suspended over that very issue. But this was driving President Lincoln, the impetus he had to establish a formal code of military action and to ensure humane and deliberate treatment of people and property, persons and property, of the belligerents as we move through their territory or they through ours. It was a badly needed organization with the hundreds of thousands of men on both sides who were enlisting, who had no military experience. A good, strong, clearly understood code of conduct for the soldier was a boon and a blessing, because most of those men, by far the great majority, had no idea how to conduct themselves as soldiers. And sometimes people can lose their sense of humanity once they become armed and in combat. And it stresses that you do not, when you put on the uniform, cease to be a moral being, nor do you escape punishment for your illegal or even heinous acts once the combat is over and indeed the war is over. War crimes can be addressed. Personal crimes committed will be addressed. So the Lieber Code is a unique instrument in warfare, all warfare indeed, up to the Civil War, when it was ordered to be developed by President Lincoln and adopted in July of 1863 under the official title of General Orders 100. And that brings to a conclusion my examination and reflection with you in the 3 parts about the Lieber Code developed by essentially Francis Lieber. And this has been a reflection on a significant activity event, the Lieber Code, in the American Civil War. I'm General Grant, and you have been looking at the Lieber Code, Part 3.